Norman Podhoretz is here. He just retired as the editor of Commentary magazine. He has been a part of the intellectual scene in America for a long time. New York Magazine, when they did a story about the 100 smartest New Yorkers, also had a story about him written by Jacob Weisberg saying, Norman Podhoretz was here, and so were most of the great mid-century literary and political thinkers, talking about New York. Much of the partisan review crowd has since fallen out, moved away, or passed on, but some of the fabled New York intellectuals are still here and still as cantankerous as ever. I don't know whether Norman was cantankerous as ever, but I'm certainly pleased to have him here to talk about a career in pursuit of ideas, in pursuit of the life of the mind, and passionately engaged by the direction of this country and ideas like freedom and anti-communism, anti-Semitism, and questions that he thought were important to be discussed by people in this nation. It's a pleasure to have Norman Podhoretz here, and his 65th year as he retires from the commentary, but certainly not planning to retire from offering ideas and opinions about things he feels passionately about. Welcome.
Thank you. Just one small correction. I haven't yet retired. Okay. I'm a lame duck.
When will you leave?
The end of April.
Okay. Why are you doing it? I mean, you didn't have to, did you?
Oh, no, on the contrary. A lot of people try to talk me out of it, but I became the editor of Commentary when I was 30, and I've been doing it now for a little over 35 years, and I've just, as you mentioned, reached my 65th birthday. Yeah. Seemed appropriate to move on to something else. The symmetries are very nice. The magazine is now celebrating its 50th anniversary.
Did it have anything to do, I mean, 65, the 50th anniversary of the magazine, but did it have anything to do with the fact that ideas that you believe in seem to have gained in the 1994 election a real sense of being the paramount ideas at work in Washington and across the country?
Well, I decided to retire before that happened, so that was not the precipitating event. But nevertheless, there was something to
the notion of the battle being won.
Yeah, well, I had the sense that that the battle was all but won, and some people have said of me that I'm a counterpuncher and happier in opposition than in power. So it may be that my sense of the impending victory had something to do with my decision to retire. Of course, I'm only retiring as an editor. I intend to go on writing.
To the magazine.
And, yeah.
Is it an apt description of you to say that you are better as a counterpuncher?
Well, it was Norman Mailer who, one of my many ex-friends. I used to say if I wish to name drop, I have only to list my ex-friends. It was he who called me a counterpuncher, and I think there's a certain justice in that. I've spent a lot of my time debating, polemicizing, and I do tend to go. To be a counterattacker. I react to things that are happening that seem to me dangerous, destructive, unhealthy, and that arouses my polemical impulses.
Newt Gingrich calls what he is about a revolution. Yeah. You call it a counter-revolution.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to quibble about the terms, but I think counter-revolution is a more precise description. Because what is happening now is a repudiation of a climate, a spirit, an ethos, a whole set of a complex of institutions that came in about 50 years ago through the New Deal and were then extended, reinforced by the Great Society programs.
This is the notion of the welfare state.
The welfare state, right, and welfare state liberalism, the functional equivalent of what in Europe they call social democracy, democratic socialism. I think that was the revolution against which what happened in November obviously didn't happen overnight, but against which resistance had been developing, and I see this not so much as a revolution leading to something new, so much as a counter-revolution restoring something old.
And what is that?
Well, the emphasis on the individual as opposed to the group, the emphasis on freedom as against equality, the emphasis on what some conservatives would call mediating institutions rather than central state power. These are all traditions that were thought of as distinctively, uniquely American before the 1930s.
Does that mean that you find yourself foursquare with the contract with America?
No, well, the contract for America, frankly, I think most Americans didn't really know what was in the contract, and I'm one of those Americans. Yeah. I mean, if you asked me to name the 10 points, I'd flunk. Yeah. But what I'm foursquare behind is the direction in which the counter-revolution wishes to move, and of which the Contract for America is the concrete expression in legislative terms.
You have been labeled a neoconservative, yeah, which you accept, I assume, with great pride.
Well, I did not at first. The term neoconservative has been bandied around a lot. As the prefix neo suggests, it means new conservative, and the term was applied to people like myself who began their political lives somewhere left of center. Some were radicals, some were liberals, and then moved rightward, and so they were new conservatives.
Did Crystal once say that a neoconservative was a liberal who'd been mugged by reality?
Mugged by reality, that's exactly right. And he said that because he was basically talking about those neoconservatives who first appeared on the scene in the mid-'60s and late '60s, who were, many of them helped to construct the programs of the Great Society, and who began to realize that they weren't working, and coming up against reality seemed to suggest the limits of the power of government programs to change things in a significant way, or in a way that was intended. I mean, many of these programs fell victim to what was called the law of unintended consequences.
I want to get to that, but I want to stay with one. Do you call yourself a conservative today?
Yeah, I do indeed. Well,
Have you first changed your registration to Republican?
Well, I'm a little embarrassed about that because I'm still a registered Democrat.
Why?
Well, partly because, first of all, my political evolution had very little to do with partisan politics. I was never an enthusiastic Democrat. I was interested in the ideas that move things, move the country, move minds, and as far as I was concerned, whichever party seemed a better vehicle for the furtherance of those ideas and principles was the party of support. So I mainly voted for Democrats, and in fact, I voted, for example, for Jimmy Carter in 1976 because I was very critical of the détente policy of the Ford administration. And I thought that Carter, having been an Annapolis graduate and a Southern good old boy, would be tough on defense. And
because he'd been an M, right?
And I was wrong. But then I later voted for Ronald Reagan. But being a Democrat was a kind of habit. Living in New York at a certain point, if you were a Republican, you were virtually disenfranchised. But I am, insofar as I'm anything these days, I am a Republican.
One last question about that. What does it mean today? Is there such a thing as a public intellectual today?
Not to the extent that they used to be. There are young people around who mainly focus on policy and on political ideas in the narrow sense. There are not all that many younger people who still maintain the tradition out of which I came and in which I grew up. The tradition, which has come to be called the tradition of the New York intellectuals, the public intellectual. We were people who were very arrogant, for one thing. That is, we thought we could pronounce on virtually anything under the sun, except maybe for the physical sciences.
If it was culture or politics, you thought you had it.
Yeah, and we specialize, as you might say, in making connections between different realms of experience and different realms of thought. we thought we understood the underlying forces better than anybody else, and sometimes we even really did. Often enough, we made mistakes. But the tradition of discourse was one, a synthesizing one. It was at one point very heavily influenced by Marxism, later by Freudianism, by most of the major currents of 20th century thought. These were all extremely articulate people.
Take me back to then. I mean, we'll come back to the question of whether they're public intellectuals today and whether they're people who do that. I mean, many people may have seen the cover of the New York Times Magazine for February 12th here. It says, look who's the opinion elite now. They're young, brainy, and ambitious, an adversarial band of conservatives winning the war against liberalism and having a grand old time, by James Atlas, who, by the way, I guess is writing a biography of Saul Bellow. But take me back to the late 50s, early 60s. Who formed the family? This group of intellectuals who all knew each other and who were doing the things that you said and had a certain hubris about themselves.
Well, the family, which is a term I use to describe these people in one of my books in making it, were centered around several magazines, Partisan Review, Commentary principally. And they were mainly literary people, literary critics, creative writers, but who, as I said before, well, the famous ones. I just noticed this week Mary McCarthy and Hannah Arendt's correspondence.
Their letters and correspondence.
They were certainly members of the family. People like Delmore Schwartz and Saul Bellow, and a younger group, including myself, would have been Susan Sontag, William Phillips and Philip Robb, who were the editors of Partisan Review. You had Lionel Trilling and his wife Diana Trilling, still both of them, Alfred Kazin, Leslie Fiedler, William Barrett.
And you shared a political philosophy and a cultural...
Well, there was a lot of disagreement and a lot of bickering.
Sure, I don't mean disagreement.
But what the family shared was what the French would call a formation. That is a kind of education. I don't mean literally. We all had grown up and read the same books and were sensitive to the same issues and the same arguments. And the great arguments of the 20th century, which had to do with the rise of totalitarianism. In Russia and in Germany, the role and the status of the bourgeois democracies, particularly America, which was very much looked down upon at a certain point by most of these people, who then changed their minds about this country as a result of World War II. The influence of the whole school of Freudian thought, the changing nature of not only American society but Western society.